Surviving Earth is a 2026 documentary series produced by Impossible Pictures, the production company known for hit series such as Walking with Dinosaurs. Now, Surviving Earth is an 8-episode series focusing on extinction events from across the Phanerozoic Eon, and while I have opinions on other episodes, the subject of episode 3, When the Asteroid Fell, is of particular interest due to its interpretation of the End Cretaceous mass extinction. This event is of special interest to me. I love it, and to people who know me, they know my obsession with it. So, I want to right now dive into this episode and dissect what Surviving Earth Episode 3 got wrong and right about the KPG. I want to mostly focus on the impact itself, so I don't want to nag too much about the pre-impact environment. But I have to at least talk about it. The Prince Creek Formation is the setting of this episode. It is a formation from Alaska, which at the time would have been even further north in latitude, being a near-polar environment. So, you might think that the lush environment shown would be inaccurate, but the Prince Creek Formation is notable for being quite lush, with numerous plants, especially pines, and also flowering plants and ferns, being found, as well as a notable greenhouse climate being present. Now, I'll quickly mention that most of the animals present in this episode are from earlier on in the Maastrichtian, but this can be explained easily with preservation bias, as we don't know definitively if they did survive to later. There are 5 animals modelled for this section, including Nenoxaurus, Saurornitholestes, Edmontosaurus, Unoconemes, and a very geographically challenged Asteriornis, as well as live-action footage of a few insects. The animals in the Maastrichtian section of the episode are overall pretty good, with all I can really think of potentially being wrong being an undersized Nenoxaurus, and the Belgian bird Asteriornis being in Alaska. And just before I get to the actual impact, I have one small gripe. A decent chunk of the background shots are filmed in Patagonia, in a very similar way to Walking with Dinosaurs, literally being filmed in the same location. Showing the Prince Creek Formation like this isn't very accurate, with them seemingly going out of their way to avoid flowering plants. A more equivalent location would actually have been boreal forests in Alaska, as the environment there would have been proper equivalents. Anyway, let's get into the actual extinction. The first thing of note for this segment is them picking the correct time of year for the episode to take place, being early spring. This has been known since 2022, when a study was published figuring out the time of year based on the annual life cycles of fish found at the Tanis site, which is a deposit from the day of impact. This is a good start, but it won't continue for long. Anyhow, it's time for impact. I will admit, the shot of impact itself is wonderful, with Surviving Earth displaying properly the speed of the impact, although I do still have some gripes. The episode gets the speed of the asteroid correct, at around 45,000 miles per hour, or in metric, 20 kilometers a second. The clouds are nearly instantly ripped away, with it looking like a shockwave, but it isn't. This represents the initial thermal pulse, where the heat from the blast evaporates the clouds. This thermal pulse would radiate from the impact site for around 800 kilometers, which the episode does mention. The next part, sadly, is where it starts to fall off, the shockwave, which they say reaches the Prince Creek in a matter of minutes, would actually have taken hours to get from the Yucatan to Alaska. It also would have been joined closely behind by the blast front of soot and ash, which they do talk about, but not at the same time. In this section, they also mention tremors, but it's likely that these are in reference to the shockwave, and not the gigantic earthquakes which did occur, but are completely absent from the episode, although tsunamis and the initial mega tsunamis are mentioned. Next, many hours later in the episode's story, comes the blast front, full of soot and ash, but it's missing something crucial: the tektites. It's quite staggering that Walking with Dinosaurs from 1999 got this more accurate than the Impossible Pictures documentary made 27 years later. Walking with Dinosaurs more accurately conveys the series of events from Shockwave, Blast Front, and Tektites, showing the true cosmic devastation caused by the asteroid impact in the initial few hours. What would have happened next is completely absent from episode 3, that being wildfires. The tektites, which they also didn't include, would have, when falling, heated the atmosphere, letting out an infrared pulse. This would have dried up plant matter and cooked animals out in the open and above water internally, and when the tektites eventually hit the ground, being as hot as melted glass, forests would have ignited globally. These wildfires are thought to have been a death blow to a majority of terrestrial megafauna, as they had nowhere to hide. Smaller dinosaurs like Saurornitholestes seen earlier in the episode would have had a better chance of survival than any giant dinosaurs, with most likely dying within the first few days. These global wildfires would have contributed to the impact winter that the episode chooses to instead focus on. The initial plume from the impact would have been joined by soot from these fires to blanket the Earth in darkness, which during the day would have had a hue of red, like what's seen in photos of smoke from bushfires. Now in the full throes of the impact winter, stuff like the stated freezing temperatures, global darkness, and acid rain did occur. But presenting it as the primary cause of the dinosaurs' extinction is not accurate. Most would have already been dead. The impact winter, though, would have been the primary reasoning why most marine extinctions occurred, as the lack of sunlight stopped photosynthesis, collapsing the global biosphere. The marine reptiles would have starved to death, rather than burnt. This would have also been the case for much of the terrestrial mycofauna that could have hidden on the first day, like mammals and birds. Now, a bit later in the episode, volcanism is mentioned as providing help to animals still alive in the freezing hell. This would have likely occurred, especially as volcanism worldwide increased as a result of impact. The volcanism, despite being deadly, could have provided the warmth many animals may have needed. Towards the tail end of the extinction, the episode correctly states that most large vertebrates were dead by 2 years in. It still presents non-avian dinosaurs being alive at this time, which may have been true, although none of the survivors would be larger species like the Nanoxaurus protagonist. He, even if lucky, would be already dead within the first few months, but most likely would have died in the first 24 hours. The impact winter depicted is also too long, with global darkness only occurring for around 2 to 3 years, rather than the 10 stated. The 10 years stated in the episode is more in line with how long it would have taken for the aerosols to disperse from the atmosphere. Over the next 10 to 16 years after the impact winter's darkness, Earth would have still been near freezing in temperatures, with those slowly rising across the period, until reaching near pre-impact heats. After this, the episode transitions to the post-impact, which is fairly well done, showing extremely dense tropical rainforests, with Earth again in a hothouse world. The lack of dinosaurs and other megafauna would have allowed for old-growth forests to proliferate, resulting in an environment like what's depicted in the show. The animals depicted, being Titanoides, Plesiodapis, and Cosmodraco, are also not bad, with all depicted having slight inaccuracies, but overall looking good. Now, my opinions on this episode are not very positive. For a documentary series trying to present an up-to-date and accurate interpretation of extinctions. It's downright disrespectful to the audience to lie. Wildfires and global firestorms are an integral part of the extinction, and to remove them is to remove an extremely crucial segment of the story. This may come across as me being overly hung up on this detail, but this would be like removing any mention of Pangea from an episode about the Great Dying. The fires were a crucial part of why the extinction was so bad, but not the primary cause. Just like how Pangea existing made the Great Dying worse due to its sheer size, but wasn't the primary cause. I believe they may have chosen to not include these sections of the extinction, so they could have the Nanoxaurus pair survive longer, so they could tell the story they wanted to tell, rather than the story that actually happened. I can understand some creative liberty, and while I admit many of the facts presented were accurate, the absence of such major events ruins its credibility as a documentary whose purpose is supposed to show the KPG in an accurate and up-to-date fashion. Now, if I were to make a remake of Surviving Earth Episode 3, but had to keep the same animals, I would change the protagonist to something smaller, like Saurornitholestes, so they could still keep the starving aspect they want to tell, as it would allow them to still have a fairly charismatic dinosaur as the lead, and not have to cut the global wildfires. But that is if I had to make an episode of Surviving Earth. My interpretation of the KPG would be a bit different. And if you want to see that, in a few weeks, part 1 of my KPG documentary will be releasing. So subscribe if you want to see that when it drops. Thank you for watching.